Hello and welcome to Cheetah Coding. So I created a few videos about state management solutions in my channel already. I talked about packages like block, getX, and provider. Now I want to add a fourth option for you, and that is called Riverpod. So Riverpod is a pretty new state management option for you, and it was created by the same guy that created the provider package. So if you go to the website here, this video will tell you about the guy that made the provider package. His name is Remy. I would advise you to watch this video. It tells you more about why he created the Riverpod package and why it's better than using provider. So here in the Get Started, it tells you a few different ways that you can actually use this package. So you can use it with hooks, with Flutter only, or with Dart only. So for this video, I'm going to use it with only Flutter here. So I'm going to use the Flutter Riverpod package. The Flutter Riverpod package is already put into this app here. So I added it here, and I'm using the null safety version of it here. Okay, so if you saw my video on Provider 5 that I did recently, then this layout should look pretty familiar to you. This is the same layout that I did for that video. So I can put in a name here, a city, and add it here, add more here, and then delete here, go to the list, and you can see it here too. Okay. So the state is in this user list widget here, which is also here too. Okay. So that is the user list.dart file here. And right now I'm just using the default state. So in my home screen, we have a cheetah input, two of these, and we have cheetah buttons here. So I created these widgets here. So we just pass in the text on pressed and the label text and the on saved function. Okay, so back to the home screen. When we press the add button, I'm calling this add user function and passing the user from the form. And we're setting the state here and updating the local user list here. And then we're passing this list to the user list widget here with this button. So when we go here, we're passing the user list and we're passing the button to delete the user. Deleting the user is up here too. So you can see setState, remove where the username is equal to the username in the list here. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So I assume if you have heard of Riverpod, then you at least know how to use setState in your app. So now I want to convert this state to Riverpod. So in this API file here, I created two functions that kind of mock a API response that you might get. So it's just a feature with a delay here of 5 seconds. And then I get the name here. So this could be any return object in your API. And then I have a stream here, which could be a Firebase stream, for example. It just creates a stream that updates every 1 second and it adds the session time to it. So it's just a session time counter 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then it returns that stream here. Okay. So I'm assuming that you know how to use features and streams. Streams can be a bit confusing at first, but they're pretty easy once you get used to them. So the first thing I want to do is I want to tell our app that we are going to be using Riverpod. So to do that, we need to go to the main.dart. And the first thing to do is to wrap our app in a provider scope widget. So this tells the app that this widget is in the scope of all the providers that we want to use. So doing that is pretty simple. We can go down here. And now I want to wrap this with a provider scope. And then the child will be my app. Oops, like so. Okay, that's it. Pretty straightforward. So one difference between Riverpod and provider is that you don't define your providers at the top level of your app. Now I will show you how to actually create your providers. I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it controller. And you'll see why I'm calling it that soon. And in controller, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this providers. You can kind of define your providers wherever you want to. For this app, I'm going to define them all in the same place. You don't always want to do that. Sometimes you want to define your provider only where you use it. That depends on where you're going to use it, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to define them all in a single file. So first I will create a provider for this name here. So down here, I will say final channel provider, or let's say channel name provider equals. So you normally define your provider like this. You don't actually give it a type. So we say equals provider. So you import the provider class here, and then you define the type here. So it's of type string because it'll just be a string here. So string, and then you create the function inside that defines what the actual data is that is being returned. First, I'm going to put a underscore here. Okay, and then I'm going to return this name here. So, and then first let's actually put that missing. And then this will be cheetah coding. And we can put that here. So this is the bare level version of a provider that you can use in your app. So you would want to define it this way with just the provider class if this is a static or unchanging value. Okay, so this channel name provider will never change. So while we are here, I will create a few other providers. So now I want to create a future provider. So a future provider is a provider that expects a future value. So we can go down here and I will say final. And this one, I will actually use it to get the profile username here. So this would represent an API call that you would have in your app. Okay, so I will call it final profile, I guess profile name provider equals future provider. So provider is the base level class, and then we have also future provider underscore return that function. So get profile username, and that's it. So you can see a common pattern here. The only difference between this and this is that this is expecting a future. And we should also probably put the type of value here. So it's a string. So we can put string type here. And you can see if you try to use a normal provider, you will get a error. So it expects a future here. Okay, and I should probably talk about this underscore here. So I'm not getting this value, but this value is a reference to the actual provider itself. So you can call it ref. I see a lot. It's a provider reference. But for now, I'm not going to use a reference to it. So I'm just going to keep it as a underscore here. So we have the standard provider, the future provider, and now I want to create a stream provider for my stream API call here. Okay, so final, then I will call it session time provider equals, and then we have a stream provider. Okay, and then for the API here, this call is an int. So we could put a int type here, underscore, because I don't care about the reference. And then I just return the session time, or I think it's get session time. Yeah. So that's all I want to do for the provider file for now. So now I want to replace the cheetah coding with the provider here. So this provider doesn't really represent state. It represents kind of like a global constant. Back to the home screen. And the first thing I want to do is I want to import our providers from our providers.dart file here. So instead of cheetah coding, we can use our context to get the value of our providers. I want to say context.read, but we need to import the Riverpod package. So let's go back to here, and I want to copy this and put it into here. And now context.read, and now we can say channel name provider. Okay, so we imported channel name provider. I'm not sure why this is here. I put an extra space here. So let's rename. There we go. Okay, so we imported our entire provider file here. All we did was replace the cheetah coding string with context.read channel name provider. So let's restart. And you can see that we have the same result here. So to test that, let's go to our provider. And I will change this to cheetah test. And let's restart. And then you can see we have cheetah test here. So that's proof that we are using our provider. So change this back to home. So that's a very, very simple way to use provider just to store some global string that you want to use in different parts of your app. So now let's say I want to replace the Riverpod demo string here with our profile username. So let's go back to the home screen. And here's the part where things get a little bit more complex. Now I want to listen for that value when it changes. So Riverpod has a few handy ways to do this. My personal favorite is to use an async value with the consumer widget. So up here in our title, we have Riverpod demo. Now to wrap our text in a consumer widget, so consumer. If you have used the provider package before, then you are familiar with the concept of a consumer. The concept is pretty much the same thing in Riverpod too, but this consumer has a few extra things to it. So let's say consumer, and then we have builder, child, and key. So the child, so we have builder, child, and key. So builder we will use for our text, and the builder takes in a few different parameters here. So first is the context, similar to provider. And then we have a watch parameter here. Okay, so watch, we'll call it. And then we have the child. The child, I don't really use it a lot, but it's there if you need it. And then we return our text widget like so, parentheses here. So as of right now, this really doesn't do anything different. We can restart and nothing has changed. So now I want to watch our future and do something when it returns. So let's get rid of the arrow function, and we're just going to do return text here. And think like this. And so with our watch, I want to create a new variable to watch our profile name. So up here, I want to create a new variable of type async value. So this is a class that I use a lot with Riverpod because, well, you'll see why in a second, but async value of type string, because the profile name is a string, and I will call it name. And then we use our watch function. So this watch here is a function. So watch, and then we wrap our profile name provider with that. So we can say profile name provider. So I hope this makes sense so far. We just have our consumer, which builds our text widget as before. And then we watch our profile name provider and assign it to a new type called async value. So async value helps you manipulate asynchronous data. This is a really, really useful class in Riverpod. So what you can do with this is, once you assign this to async value type here, you can say name dot. So the async value has a few different fields here. You can get the data directly here when it finishes, or you can do something I like to do, which is called when. So when gives you the option to create a loading widget. So before the data is returned, you can assign a loading widget here, and you can also assign a error widget here too. So each of these expects a widget. Okay. So for the data, you get back that data field. So let's just call it name here. And then you decide what to show with that name string here. Okay. And for that, I'm just going to show our text here. So copy and get rid of this, and then return the text here. For the loading, I want to put a text here too. So I'm going to paste this here. I want to say loading dot. And for the error, this expects two things here. So you get the error itself, which I'll name E, and then it has a stack trace. So you can say stack trace here. Remember, these all expect a widget, so I will put text error. Okay. And we're getting this error here because we're not actually returning anything. So let's return this. And like this. And these are functions, so this should be a function here. So that's a bit of boilerplate with the when code, but I think it's pretty useful because you can define your loading widget and your error widget all in the same place here. So if you don't want to actually define your loading widget and your error, you could just say return name dot data, or you could say return text name dot data dot value, like so. And then we're using null safety. So, okay. We want to show a loading and an error here. So let's go back to before. So let's restart and see how this looks. You can see loading. And after 5 seconds, you see Riverpod demo. That's because I forgot to add the name in here. So let's put the name right here. Let's restart. And you see Julian Curry. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope you see why this is very powerful. So now let's create some actual state. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to the controller folder, and I want to create a new controller. So this will be a user list, and then I'll just call it user list.dart. And this file will actually have our state for our list here. So creating state in Riverpod is a bit different than Flutter, or sorry, a bit different than Provider. So in Provider, you have your change notifier with your state, and your provider would be the change notifier provider, I think it's called. Riverpod does have that, but they actually encourage you to use the state notifier instead. So I will show you the difference here. So first, I want to create a new class. I will call this user list controller. And then I want to extend something called a state notifier. So instead of a change notifier in Provider, we will use the state notifier in Riverpod. And then you tell it the actual type that you want to store. So this will be a list of users. And let's import our user model. So the main difference between this and the change notifier is that the state notifier is used for one type of state. So as you can see here, we told it that this is a list of users. So that's all you can store in this is the list of users. That's it. With a change notifier, you can put whatever types you want inside of it. You can store like 50 different variables inside of it if you want to. I kind of like the way that Riverpod does it because it kind of forces you to think more carefully about what you store in state and where you put things at in your state hierarchy. So for the user list controller, you get an error here. It expects a super constructor. Okay. So let's just do that. We pass in the state here by default, and then we set that state here. So if you want to know more about StateNotifier, you can go into here and you can look at all this wonderful code here. But the main thing to realize is that it has a single piece of state, which is a single object of whatever type you want it to be. This could be a string or whatever you want. Okay. So now we will create the actual control functions to manipulate the state. So first I want to add a user. So void add user. And then I want to pass in the user object. So user. So the same concept with the provider package applies here. You don't want to manipulate the state directly. So what I like to do is I like to assign the new state to the old state. Okay, so I want to say state equals, then I will put brackets here, state. So this would be all the current state plus the new user at the end of the list here. Okay, and that's it. So I'm taking the new user and I'm appending it to the end of the current state list. And down here, I want to say void. We can get rid of the void, I guess, here. So I want to say delete user. And then I want to pass in the user object. You can pass in whatever you want to here. You can pass in the index. You can pass in the name. But I'll pass in the entire user object here. And then I will say state equals state dot where. So I want to define where we want to remove the state. I will say underscore user because this will represent each user in our list. And then I want to say where the user dot name. I could define like an ID in the user, like a unique ID, but for this video, I'll just say name not equal to user, this user dot name. Okay, and then this has to be a list. Right now, this is just a iterable. So let's say .to list. So we're saying that the new state equals the current state minus the user that fits this Boolean value here. It could be more than one too, but where the name that we pass in is equal to the name in the list as we go through it. If those are the same, then we delete that user, and then we create the new list and assign it back to the state. Okay, not too complicated, pretty simple stuff here. That's all I want to do for the user list controller. Let's go back to the home screen. Now I want to wrap this in a consumer. I want to say consumer, and then for the builder, we have our context, watch, and child. If you don't want to use the child too, you can just put underscore here. And then I want to return the cheetah button, but actually let's just use the normal function here. Return this, return brackets. So now we have access to watch the state. So up here in our consumer, the watch was for our actual provider itself, not for any controller or state notifier. Now down here, we want to access the actual controller class, which is this, but we don't have an actual provider for this yet. So let's go to the providers.dart, and I want to create one more provider, and this provider actually represents state. So down here, I want to say final user list provider equals, and then we have a new provider type called StateNotifierProvider. So StateNotifier, StateNotifierProvider. And then we could tell it what type here too. We could say user list controller. So I want to return the user list controller here. So underscore, then return user list controller. We pass in the state, but we don't actually have to do this. We can say, get rid of this here, and we can just pass in an empty array. So this empty array will represent the initial user list state. So save, and back to the provider. And now we could just not pass anything in here. Do this. We just have a user list controller, okay? So this expects a state notifier. If you try to return something else, you'll get an error like test. You see, so, okay. So that's all we want to do for the state notifier here. So let's go back to the home screen. And now I want to get that provider in our consumer here. So doing this is a little bit different. So let's go up here and I want to say final user list controller equals, and then we can say context.read, and then I want to say user list provider. Okay, you can see we have an error here, right? So these errors can be a little bit confusing, but basically it's saying that the types don't match. So the difference here between how we did it before is that here, since we're sending it to a state notifier, this provider has a state notifier built into it. So you can say dot notifier. Okay. So this says obtains the state notifier associated with this state notifier provider. Okay. And this is important too. It doesn't listen to it. So that's what we want here for this button. Okay. So all this might seem a bit confusing. You just need to get used to the procedure of doing this. If you want to read a notifier, you would use read. Don't use watch. Use read. So now I want to use the controller to add a new user. Now we're using this local function, but now we can get rid of it. So let's get rid of the add user here and delete user. So no more local state. So we can get rid of the user list here. And now down here, I can say controller dot add user, because that's part of our state notifier here. Okay, so we don't have our user list anymore. So down here, we were passing that state, that local state, to our user list screen and our user list down here. We can get rid of Actually, before I do that, let's change the delete user too. So we can get rid of these here. So I'll get rid of the delete user too, because we'll change that here in a second. So let's get rid of these and this. And now we can remove this and this, which means that we can change this entire thing to a stateless widget. Let's go stateless widget, like so, stateless widget. Okay, and we can get rid of these here, and we can get rid of all this here too. So that's the main goal, is to make it so we don't have to pass all the state around and all these functions around too. Okay, so down here in our user list, remember this is the list here and on the next screen too. So instead of the users being passed into this widget, we want to consume the user list from our StateNotifier. So like we did before, since we're using the users in most of this file here, I'll just wrap the entire list view in a consumer. So consumer, and then I'll say context, watch, and child. And then brackets here, return. Okay, and since we're using the user list in most of this file, I want to wrap this entire list view in the consumer. So we'll say consumer, we have our context, watch, and child here. And then we can do the brackets, return, then down here, there we go. Okay, we can get rid of this now. And I will put the watch function above the return statement here. So I can say final user, let's call it user list, equals watch, and then we will watch our user list provider. So we'll say user list provider, and then we'll replace that down here. So we can say user list, user list, user list. Okay. And now for the on delete, I showed you how to access the controller and the home widget. So let's go down here and user list controller equals same thing before. We'll say context.read, and then we will use our user list provider dot notifier. So that gives us our controller here. And then we can say controller dot delete user. And then for the user here, we want to pass in the user list here. Okay. And that's it. So you can see how this is a lot more clean than what we had before. We're not passing around a bunch of variables to different widgets. You can imagine how effective this would be on a much larger app with maybe 50 different screens that need to access the same variables. Okay, so let's see if this all works correctly. Let's restart. See loading here. And then let's put in some names here. Add list screen. You can see it's here. Let's delete this one, list. So a lot less code, a lot more structured code. We have all of our state in this one file here. You can add more state if you want to. The concept of creating the providers like this is very useful because you can actually put these wherever you want to. These aren't defined in your top tree structure, so they're not actually related to your widget tree itself. So you can have the same provider types defined. So one thing I want to do too is I want to show you when the widgets are being updated. So let's go to the home widget. Let's go up here and I want to print home rebuilding and copy this and put this in the user list rebuilding. Okay, so let's restart. So you can see when the app first loads, we have home building and user list building. Let's add a new user, see what happens. So you can see that the home list was not rebuilt and the user list was not rebuilt. If you were using the original code with setState, then every time we add a new user, then the entire home screen was rebuilt, including the widget itself. So let's delete a user. Same thing, you can see that it's not rebuilt. So using state management is a very, very good thing for performance. You don't want to rebuild the entire list view when you update one thing on the screen. So this is a very, very useful library for that. So one last thing I want to go over is I want to go over the stream here. So I didn't actually implement this yet. So get session time and the session time provider. So I'm going to actually add a new text widget in the app bar up here. So back to the home screen. Up here in the app bar, I will add let's do it down here. I will say leading. And then for the leading, I will create a centered. So this will be centered child. And then we'll have a text. And the text will actually just be, let's just have it be a 0 for now. Let's restart, see how it looks. Let's add some styling to this. Let's do style, font, style, or font size, text style and font size. Let's make it 22, I guess. That looks good. You could wrap the center widget in a consumer, but it doesn't really make sense. So let's wrap this in a consumer builder, context, watch, and underscore. Let's return the text. Let's actually do this. Return. That looks okay. And now I want to watch the actual session time provider. So up here, I will say async. I use async value a lot. Int, and then I will say time equals watch. Import our session time provider. And that's it for the async value. And now we can say return time dot when. You can also say when data too. So when data, and you could just return the text here. But I like using when a lot. So we'll say text, pass in the time, or let's say value. Value, get rid of this. Okay, and for the loading, I just want something to show you that it's loading, but not a lot of text here. So I'm just gonna put a text and just say question mark. Okay, and for the error, doesn't really matter, but text error. And this should be E and a stack trace. Put trace. Instead of 0, I want to pass in the actual int value. So value dot toString. ToString. Okay, so when the app first loads, this will go up by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're watching that value to make sure that it increments here. Okay, so we start. Question mark 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see this will go up forever until we tell it to stop. So I think I want to stop for the video now. This is enough for Riverpod. I think I will create a part 2 because there's still more that I want to go over. Real quick, just to kind of go over what I did here, I created a normal provider, which is just a way to create kind of like a global variable here, or a global object if you want to. And then I created a feature provider, which allows you to show a widget when a feature finishes. I created a stream provider, which lets you use a stream as the actual object. And then I created the StateNotifierProvider, which actually represents actual state in your app. So the user list controller controls the state of our user list. And if you want to create more pieces of state, you would go down here, And you can create like a maybe in your app you have a shopping cart, so you would create like a shopping cart .dart, and then you have a shopping cart controller extends change notifier, etc. And then you have a shopping cart model here. So you would use the shopping cart model for your super here, like this. I will probably create a part 2 where I go over things like modifiers and actually nesting different providers. That was kind of a pain to do in the provider package, but it's a lot easier to do in the Riverpod package. So yeah, stay tuned for the next video and happy coding. Bye.